Bobby was not getting along well with his new babysitter.
CJ was diagnosed the summer before he started kindergarten. And I think we knew from the time he was about 10 months old that he was different. In fact, from when he was 5 days old, the nurse walked into my hospital room carrying him, saying, "You're going to drive your mother crazy."
My dad also gets mad when he comes home and finds something broken that I accidentally broke. That just wastes his time because he has to fix it.
The effects of having an ADD child on your marriage relationship, no matter how well-grounded or how secure, I guess, you feel in your marriage, an ADD child is an extreme challenge from the standpoint that it's so multidimensional.
He wouldn't listen to her. He wouldn't do anything she told him to do. He would challenge everything. And then in the end, he would just throw a temper tantrum and she'd call me.
I poured, and still do, pour out my life to my children. And then seeing our middle son with a problem, I kept thinking, what am I doing wrong? I'm a nurse. My husband is a physician. I should know this. I should have some answers. And I felt very much like a failure.
So one day while I was at work, she called me and said, "I have Bobby at the library and he won't leave. Could you come down and get him? And by the way, I quit."
All About Attention Deficit Disorder, Part 1. Dr. Thomas W. Phelan is a clinical psychologist and nationally known expert on ADD. He's also the parent of an ADD child. On these tapes, he will explore ADD, what it is, how it is diagnosed, and how it is treated. Joining Dr. Phelan will be some parents of ADD kids and their children. Part 1 covers ADD's symptoms, development, prognosis, and causes. Now here is Dr. Phelan.
Thank you very much. Our topic today is what is called attention deficit disorder. This is a problem that is very widespread and very perplexing to a lot of people. It's been estimated that up to 40% of first referrals to child guidance clinics throughout the country are ADD. And if 40% of our problem kids are attention deficit, you can see the magnitude of the problem. It's also very misunderstood, as many of you know, and that is the reason for this workshop today. ADD has not always been called ADD. It's been called quite a few other things. In fact, one writer estimated that in the last 80 years, it's probably had about 20 different labels. Some of those include things like Still's disease, impulse disorder, minimal brain damage, and minimal brain dysfunction. I think some of you may be a little, this may be a little bit in the past to have gotten a diagnosis of minimal brain damage, but it was extremely frightening to a lot of parents when that type of thing was thrown at them. It's also been called hyperkinesis or hyperkinetic reaction to childhood, hyperactivity, and then attention deficit disorder. And then recently they changed attention deficit disorder to the notorious, I should say, ADHD, which some of you have heard of. ADHD stands for Attention Deficit Hyperactivity Disorder. I don't like that, and I don't use it. I always say the person that invented ADHD is the same guy that wrote Peter Piper picked a peck of pickled peppers. I don't know what the guy was thinking of that day, but it's unnecessarily complex. So I'm going to use ADD in my talk, attention deficit disorder. And I'm going to also make a bet with you that in 1991, when DSM-4 comes out, you're going to see some reversion back to ADD or something less awkward and less silly than the ADHD. But if you see ADHD, that's basically the same kind of thing that I'm talking about now. Also, going back to our previous diagnostic and statistical manual, I still like the 3 breakdowns of ADD that they had there, and that was ADD with hyperactivity, which refers to a child, usually a young child, who has trouble concentrating and is also very active, not necessarily all the time, but tends to do a lot of running around and is also fairly restless. Then we have ADD without hyperactivity, which I think is a legitimate diagnosis. It refers to a child who has trouble concentrating, but who doesn't necessarily run around a lot, doesn't get into the gross motor hyperactivity so much. A lot of people believe, interestingly enough, that a lot of the ADD girls have a strong tendency to be less hyperactive than ADD boys. Now, there's ADD girls that are as hyperactive as any boy that you'd ever want to see, but the girls do have a tendency to be a little bit more simmered down. They often fall into what some people call the pleasant space cadet syndrome. And what that means is that they just sit in the back of the class, they don't bother anybody, and they say, well, there's little Marcia back there, you know, she's a cute little thing, probably has an IQ of around 85, but she doesn't bother anybody, and we'll just leave her be. She's doing the best she can. If they tested little Marcia, they might find out that she has an IQ of 135. She's unrecognized ADD without hyperactivity, and something ought to be done. One of the problems with the girls then, and this is something that you should all keep an eye out for, we think a lot of times that we're missing the girls because they don't cause enough trouble to come to the attention of the people who should be diagnosing them and doing something for them. And finally, the third category is ADD with, ADD without, and finally, I still use the ADD residual. ADD residual refers to a person who's an adult who was probably ADD with hyperactivity as a child and who now carries into adulthood some of the residual symptoms of attention deficit disorder. Some of you may know that we used to believe that ADD was outgrown. And we now know that it is not outgrown. Most of the ADD children will carry into adulthood a good portion of the symptoms that they had as children. They may mellow out a little bit, but they're still going to carry a lot of them into adulthood. And so ADD residual is a term that we use for that particular group. What I want to do to start with, we're going to talk first about what is ADD before in our next sections we get into things like diagnosis and treatment. What I'm going to do is give you my list of the 8 symptoms of attention deficit disorder. There's nothing sacred about the list. I have 8 symptoms that I list, and I think they'll give you an overall perspective of what this is and how it operates in a person's life. You'll read other writers, and they'll give you 3 symptoms. Some people give you 5. Some people give you more. In the DSM-3R, as many of you know, they have a list of 14 symptoms, and you pick 8. If your kid has 8, then they will give them a diagnosis of attention deficit disorder. So my 8 symptoms are a little bit different from these. But let me go down through the list and tell you what they are. The first symptom to qualify for ADD, obviously, is that you have to have trouble concentrating. But a couple of catches here. The concentration problem must be something that operates at an age-inappropriate level. We don't get parents coming into us and complaining that they have a 2-year-old with a short attention span. Why? Because all 2-year-olds have short attention spans. But an ADD child is a 5-year-old with the attention span of a 2-year-old, or a 9-year-old with the attention span of a 5-year-old. And so that may be diagnosable. So age-inappropriate attention is the core symptom. Another catch here is the fact that the ADD child will not always be inattentive. And this throws the diagnosis off lots and lots of times. The attention, just like the hyperactivity that we'll get into a little bit later, can vary or almost disappear in situations that have certain characteristics. And these are very important to keep in mind. An attention deficit child may not look like attention deficit in situations that are either novel, interesting, intimidating, or one-on-one. So if a situation is new, child may not have an attention problem. If it's interesting to the child, not to you, they may not have an attention problem. We had a little boy recently who was a freshman in high school, and he could not read his English text. It was just too boring for him. For fun, what he would do when he went home was he would read Inside the Third Reich. Now, you would not expect an ADD child to read Inside the Third Reich. He read the thing and he finished it while he wasn't through the first chapter of his English text at school. So if it's interesting to them, they can often, not always, but they can often obliterate the attention problem. If the situation is intimidating, the child can sit still often and pay attention. And also if it's one-on-one. One-on-one means just the child and one other person. Many of these kids, and you parents know this, in fact, we have a divide and conquer rule when you're trying to deal with one or more children in a family. It's often better to split them up, one parent with one and one parent with the other, than to have them together all the time. But one-on-one, these kids often do very well. There's another situation, interestingly enough, where ADD kids at least aren't hyperactive. They may not always attend better, but that's when they're sick. Some of these kids, when they're sick, will kind of mellow out, and they'll do just fine. I'll have mothers come into me every once in a while, and I'll say to them, "How was your week?" And they'll say, "Well, it's pretty good, but I feel guilty." And I say, "Why do you feel guilty?" They'll say, "Well, my week was good because my child was sick, and he was just laying around all the time." And I'll say, "Well, I understand your child was sick, but why do you feel guilty?" And the parent will say, "Because I'm not sure I want him to get better." And of course, they're kidding, and they don't really mean that. But it is a blessing, and you've probably been through it. Some kids are worse when they're sick, but some of these kids will lose some of the hyperactivity when they are not feeling so well. So novel, interesting, intimidating one-on-one is very important. Just a couple of things along those lines. Two situations that are very worthy of note that fulfill a lot of those criteria and goof up diagnoses many times are, number one, psychological testing in a school setting or privately. If you have your child tested in school, you may find that because it's one-on-one with an examiner, it's often interesting to the child, it is intimidating, okay, and fulfills all those characteristics, the child may do just fine. And the psychologist can come back to his staffing and say, "I don't think this kid could possibly be attention deficit because he sat still through the testing and did just fine." That does not contradict the diagnosis necessarily. The acid test of ADD in a child is how he does in a class of 25 or 30 kids when there's not just one person watching over him. The other really important situation is a visit to a pediatrician. We have evidence that suggests that 80% of ADD kids will sit still in the office of a pediatrician, and it may also be true that 80% of pediatricians are not aware of that, which puts a lot of heat on mom in particular. We'll talk about that a little bit more. The other side of inattention is what you can think of as distractibility. We're still talking about the first symptom here. Distractibility is the ease with which the child has gotten off task by stimuli in his or her environment that take them away from the work that they're supposed to be doing. There are basically four kinds of distractors, and you probably know what they are. One is visual. Things that the child sees, moving around, other kids going to the pencil sharpener, birds flying by outside, the things that the child sees that make him look up and follow the action. Second kind of distractor is auditory distractors. Auditory distractors are obviously things that the child hears that get him off task. And you'll see, if you watch an ADD kid in class, and some of you are teachers, you'll see that he'll be working on his work, and he'll hear a noise, and the head will go up and follow the noise. He's always moving toward whatever's the novel stimulus in the room. Another set of distractors is fantasy distractors. ADD kids are often accused of daydreaming, and this is true. They do daydream quite a bit. They'd rather think about their Nintendo game and how they're going to save the princess on Super Mario 3 in the evening rather than do their boring social studies. And so you'll see them kind of drifting off into space. We had a little boy a couple of years ago, whole class was taking a math test. And this boy was sitting there daydreaming. He did not know there was a math test going on. He was just totally out of it. So you'll see that kind of distractor. Then we also have somatic distractors. You can get a number of these things, but for example, it's getting close to lunchtime. The kid's stomach is growling. And so he's focused more on his stomach growling than he is on his mathematics. We had one little boy whose mother almost killed him one morning because she went into his room and she found 23 pairs of socks unraveled and all over the floor. And she said, "What are you doing?" He said, "I can't find a pair of socks that don't itch my big toe." His problem was that the socks had a seam in the end of the sock, and it would hit his big toe funny, and it would bother him, and he'd be squirming around like this during the class day, and the teacher would say, what's wrong? And he'd say, "These socks are itching my big toe." And so he'd just throw the socks all over the place. Drove his mother nuts. She went through tube socks, wool, all these different materials. I saw her a few months ago, said, "How's it going with the socks?" She said, "It's doing pretty good. We finally found some that he can wear, but now his collars are itching him." So it's kind of hard to win. But those are some of the distractors that'll get the kids off task, and an ADD child is much more easily taken off task in a school situation than in other situations too than the average child. Second symptom on my list is impulsivity. Impulsivity means acting without thinking or speaking without thinking. ADD kids are known for just doing It's sort of like that Nike commercial, just do it. You know, don't think ahead, you just go ahead and do the thing. Well, sometimes that's good, but a lot of times it's bad because they can steal or they can blurt things out or they can hit people without really thinking of what the consequences are going to be. We've had ADD kids who have done things that are tragic because of impulsivity. We've had a couple of kids that have burned down their homes. They're playing with fire in the living room in a wastebasket. The thing got out of hand, caught the curtain on fire, and eventually the whole house went up. A little 4-year-old boy went to the swimming pool, almost killed himself. He didn't know how to swim. His father turned his back for just a second. The boy went over to the pool, saw water, thought fun. As far as his thought processes went, he jumped. He sank straight to the bottom, was down there for 3.5 minutes. They pulled him out. He was blue. And he's revived now, but we think that there's no residual brain damage. But that is a classic definition of impulsivity. So these kids will often do that kind of stuff. Those of you who are teachers, you will many, many times, I'm sure, run into kids in the classroom who blurt things out. We'll talk about that a little bit more. It's very, very common with the ADD child. They just can't wait. Got to be first in line, got to blurt something out, and that's impulsivity. I had a little boy once, and we were talking about the possibility of medication. He had burned down the tool shed in his backyard, and his parents said this was an impulsive act, and so I was trying to explain to this little 9-year-old what impulsivity meant. We were also talking at the time about the possibility of medication, and I said medication might help with the impulsivity. We don't know until we try it, but it might help. He looked at me and said, well, if I take this medication and I'm impulsive now, will the medication make me pulsive? I said, well, yeah, I guess so. You know, if it works, maybe that's something that we can shoot for. Symptom number 3 is difficulty delaying gratification. What this means is kind of a fancy way of saying impatience. ADD kids want what they want when they want it, which is right now, and if you don't give it to them, they will badge you to death, hound you, have a royal temper tantrum, just give you all sorts of static until you come across with the goods. They are often very difficult to handle around the holidays. They can be very difficult to handle around their birthdays. Anytime where it requires waiting, they are rotten at waiting. And you've seen this time after time after time. This has some interesting manifestations that can affect schoolwork. One of the manifestations is that ADD kids very, very often will rush their work. They'll hurry. They'll scribble, scribble, scribble. You know, there it is, I'm done. Whether it's the teacher or the parent. You look at this thing, it's hardly legible. You know, you're not sure if it's right side up or upside down, and you make them do it over again. What is going through the child's mind is it takes too long to do this stupid work. I want to get this done as fast as I can and beyond to something that is more fun, like Nintendo or TV or whatever. Some of you know that my oldest was ADD. I should say he is ADD. He's a little bit older now. We had a rule in our house, never walk through the kitchen in the middle of the night when it's dark. Now you say, why is that? Well, it has to do with difficulty delaying gratification. He would have a tendency of looking for things in drawers in the kitchen. And so he'd look for something in a drawer. If it wasn't in the drawer, he would just leave. It would take too long to shut the stupid drawer. And so cupboards and all this. So if you don't turn on the kitchen light, you get hit in the head or right here with the drawer. And it's very dangerous walking through our kitchen if you couldn't see where you were going. So difficulty delaying gratification, the kid who throws his coat on the floor coming home from school and rushes in to watch TV, that's difficulty delaying gratification. But again, keep in mind we're talking about more than what you'd see in the average child. A lot of 2-year-olds have difficulty delaying gratification, but ADD kids, it's much more than that. Symptom number 4 is hyperactivity. Hyperactivity refers to gross motor restlessness, or running around a lot. In the older kids, some of the time it refers to the fidgetiness. You know, older kids, as they get into adolescence, a lot of times will outgrow the hyperactivity, but not necessarily the fidgetiness. That's where the idea came from a long time ago, that you would outgrow the whole problem. Because the most obvious symptom, hyperactivity, diminished by adolescence, they thought, hey, lady, don't worry about it. By the time he's a teen, he will outgrow it. And some of you may have heard that. It's not really the case. The hyperactivity is on the go. They look like they're driven by a motor. My son walked at 9 months, but we always say he didn't walk at 9 months. He ran at 9 months, and he ran forever after. He still has a tendency to run down the stairs. I don't think in our house he's walked down the stairs in his whole life. He takes the first landing in one leap. That's 5 stairs. He's never touched those in his life. The carpet's brand new, and then the rest of it he can walk down. So the hyperactivity is there, but the hyperactivity, keep in mind, like the attention, can disappear if the situation is novel, interesting, intimidating, or one-on-one. We have children who will sit still. If a doctor or pediatrician or psychologist ever says to you, can your child ever sit still? And you say, yes, when he's watching TV. And the doctor says, well, that means that he couldn't be hyperactive. That means nothing. It just means that he's interested in what he's watching. Now, we have some kids that are so hyperactive that they cannot watch TV, but that's rare. We had one little boy, I always tell a story, a cute little 4-year-old could sit and watch TV. In fact, this little boy at age 4 had watched Superman 2 20 times. He would sit there. Mother came in to me. She said, it's the only way I can control this kid. I said, I feel guilty. He's watched this stupid movie 20 times. What should I do? I said, go for number 21. That's a good deal. So the hyperactivity will be there, but not necessarily always. And in one-on-one situations, it won't necessarily be there. That is one of the most destructive myths in the whole field of attention deficit disorder, is that ADD kids are always hyperactive. They are not. And you really want to keep that in mind. Next symptom, and this is one that used to drive me crazy as a parent, and I'm sure it's been very difficult for a lot of you, is emotional over-arousal. What this refers to is a tendency of the ADD child to feel whatever they feel very, very intensely and to broadcast it to everybody around them. 2 biggest examples of it are temper. You have a child who is mad, and when he's mad, and it can be over the stupidest thing. I have parents tell me all the time, you won't believe the dumb thing that this kid got mad about. I put the knife and the fork reversed on his place at the table, and he had a cow. Or he went to the zoo and they were out of hot dogs and he had a fit. It can be just the tiniest thing and they will get mad. But the anger goes so far beyond the stimulus that it's absolutely incredible. So you get the major temper tantrums and sometimes insane looking activities. Actually, some parents will come to me with the thought that their child is actually psychotic. And a few are, but that's very rare. More often, what you'll find is that the child is experiencing the emotional over-arousal that's characteristic of attention deficit disorder. Now, that's on the negative side. On the positive side, sort of, emotional over-arousal can get our ADD buddies into what we call the hyper-silly routine, especially in groups. And I would bet you that a lot of you have seen this. You put an ADD kid in a group, and he'll get overexcited. He'll start acting silly, he'll start acting stupid, he'll start turning people off, he'll start getting pushy. The sad thing about it is, if you're the parent, half of you, your heart is broken for your child. The other half of you wants to murder him. The kids that are looking at him and what he's doing are thinking, what a weirdo. You can see the looks on their faces. Who has no idea what's going on? Your child. He just has no idea what is happening. ADD kids are not known for their social sensitivity. They don't read the cues. They don't read the nonverbal cues, like the look on your face, the tone of your voice, and that type of thing. And they also don't even read the verbal cues some of the time. One of the worst things you can do in that situation is go in there and tell the kid to calm down. It's not going to work. But your only alternative is to remove him from the situation. We used to have a rule at our house. If you're going to have a birthday, the hyperactive child was going to have a birthday, there was a limit to how many kids could come over. The limit was 5 kids for the birthday party and max 2 that could sleep over later. He was 10 years old one time. I came back from work, and it was his birthday. I said to my wife, he said, how many kids are coming over tonight? She said, 5. I said, okay. I said, how many are sleeping over? She said, 5. I said, wait a minute, the deal was 2. And she said, well, I talked it over with him, and he thought that they could handle it, and so we're having 5 kids sleep over. I looked at her and I said, are you sure you want to do this? And she said, yes. So I went to a motel. I don't want you to think that I'm a heartless wretch, but I did. I thought, lady, you made your bed, you can lie in it. Actually, she didn't have much chance to lie in it because the poor thing was up to 4 o'clock in the morning. I came back the next day. There were bags under her eyes, and I said, how did it go? And she mumbled something incoherent. And I didn't have the heart to say, I told you so. But if you do have an ADD child, watch the birthday parties because these kids often get overstimulated in large groups and they can drive you crazy. So the emotional overarousal can affect the hypercily, the anger. It seems to, maybe in older kids, affect depression, but that comes out more in adolescence. Sometimes it'll affect anxiety. Rarely does the emotional overarousal seem to affect guilt. We wish it did some of the time, but it doesn't seem to affect guilt a lot in these children. Not that they have no consciences. Symptom number 6 is what we call noncompliance, and that simply means that ADD kids have a difficult time following rules. Now, if you had symptoms 1 through 5, you'd probably have difficulty following rules too, so you can see these symptoms tend to overlap. But ADD kids have trouble following the rules in the heat of battle. Later on, when you talk to them about what happened, they can often tell you, what went wrong and what they should have done, although they're often busy blaming everybody else for what went on. We'll talk about that a little bit later. But right at the time, they cannot remember the rule and they don't act on it. So they have trouble following rules. There's 2 kinds of noncompliance. One is aggressive defiance, angry temper tantrums, yelling at you and all that. The other kind of noncompliance is passive noncompliance, which includes things like, say, being sloppy or being forgetful. Symptom number 7 is social problems. ADD kids are notorious for having social difficulties with other kids. Because they're often so bossy, and that's usually one of the biggest problems. They're too bossy and they're too aggressive. They tend to turn other children off. Because they have low frustration tolerance, they have a hard time playing games with other kids. They're poor losers. They're extremely competitive. They'll take their ball and go home. They'll fight. They'll argue. They'll yell. They'll change the rules in the middle of the game. Have you ever seen your child change the rules right in the middle of the game when it doesn't suit him or what was written in the manual? And so they'll do that, and then they'll try and persuade the other kids. The sad part about that is that the result of all this is that the ADD child often winds up either isolated or playing with younger children. So social problems are very, very, very common and a source of major distress to the parents of these kids. Final symptom, and symptom number 8, is disorganization. I kind of mentioned this before. ADD kids are often sloppy. They have difficulty following the rules. They're forgetful. Their sense of time can be very bad. Their sense of time can be very poor. They forget to bring their homework books home. They forget to do their homework. We always say one of the things that drives parents crazy is an ADD child who doesn't do his homework. But what really drives a parent crazy is an ADD child who does his homework and then loses the paper. How many of you have been through that? Quite a few of you. Okay. You'll find if you go through his desk a couple weeks later, there it is. It's all in there. He just never turned it in. He lost it. This disorganization is very, very difficult to deal with. Those of you who are fathers of ADD kids, I can guarantee you, if your child is in the 6 to 8-year-old range right now, you're going to buy 3 sets of tools by the time he hits 18 and leaves home. I know because that's what I did. I tell you, a good way to find your tools, though, if you lost a tool, there's no use asking the child because he'll say he doesn't know where it is. Best way to find a lost tool is to cut the grass. It doesn't do a lot of good for your lawnmower, but you'll find a hammer. Okay. So basically, those are our 8 symptoms. By the way, if you're talking about ADD with hyperactivity, you very often find all 8 symptoms. If you're talking about ADD without hyperactivity, look for symptoms 1, 6, and 8. And that means 1 is inattention, 6 is noncompliance of the passive variety, and 8 is disorganization. The emphasis of those 3, of course, is on the concentrational problem that manifests itself a lot of times, mostly at school. Just a brief history. I don't want to bore you with a lot of history, but ADD is not something that has been recognized just recently. In fact, it's been recognized for maybe more than a century. It, of course, wasn't called attention deficit disorder. In the 1800s, according to Russell Barkley, there was someone who wrote a poem in Europe, I believe, called Fidgety Phil Who Couldn't Sit Still. And it described a boy who had problems with restlessness, concentration, and so on. Early 1900s, a guy named Still, who had no relation to the poem, was observing kids who had some neurological problems. And he started inferring that these neurological problems and brain damage and things like that might cause hyperactivity. This idea was reinforced in 1918 when there was an outbreak of encephalitis in the United States. And some people noted that some of the kids who had had encephalitis, which we know can cause brain damage, were hyperactive afterwards. So they started getting an idea, maybe this is caused by brain damage. 1937, a guy named Bradley, in a different vein, was the first one to use stimulant medications in dealing with attention deficit kids. I think in Baltimore, in an inpatient psych unit, he used benzodrine, which is not used now, but he reported substantial gains in many of the kids in their social performance, academic, and behavioral performance. His work was largely forgotten. It may have been too early for people to really get into this kind of thing. In the 40s and 50s, the work of Strauss and some other people really got the minimal brain damage idea going. So they were thinking there's some tissue damage, lesions, or something in the brain that is causing this. It wasn't until 1977 that they really put that one to bed. A guy named Rutter in the Isle of Wight came up with a study where he demonstrated that 95% of kids that are hyperactive show no hard signs of brain damage. And in return, 95% of kids who have brain damage are not hyperactive. So it kind of blew the theory out of the water. It doesn't mean that there aren't ADD kids or ADD-looking kids, kids that look like ADD, where brain damage doesn't play a role. But we believe that it doesn't play a role in most of the children who are afflicted with this. 1974, another historical note, Ben Feingold came out with his famous book, Why Your Child is Hyperactive. He claimed in the book that hyperactivity and learning disabilities in more than 50% of the kids affected by them are caused by artificial additives, colorings, flavorings, and naturally occurring chemicals called salicylates that occur in some fruits and vegetables. And he thought these things were the culprit. And it was almost an allergic response he was talking about. There are still 20,000 Feingold associations in the United States today, in spite of the fact that systematic double-blind controlled placebo research has failed to really support Feingold's hypotheses. But before you go dumping Feingold in the wastebasket, there still may be a small percentage of kids that are diet sensitive. Now, it may be an allergy and not really ADD, but we take parents seriously if they tell us that their child has some bad reaction to a particular substance. So we're always very careful with that. But you should know that the overall research tends to indicate that diet does not cause hyperactivity, in spite of the fact that the Feingold diet still is used in a lot of different places. 1972, the beginnings of the ADD theory started. Some people credit different writers, but a lot of people look at Virginia Douglas at McGill University in Canada, in Montreal, and she had what you might call the stop, look, and listen theory. Stop, look, and listen theory is the idea that ADD kids have trouble stopping, looking, and listening when entering a new situation, and so they just respond impulsively, do whatever comes naturally to them, and that this causes them a lot of difficulty. In fact, the difficulties that they experience can be pretty widespread throughout their lives.
He was such an active child. He didn't walk, he ran. He didn't climb tables, he climbed walls with his bare hands. He started talking in sentences and paragraphs immediately, and he was always where he shouldn't be and doing what he shouldn't be doing and doing it to someone, and he really had a difficult toddlerhood.
If I'm real mad at my sister, sometimes I take her and just slam her into her room, onto her bed, and then leave and slam the door behind me. Or sometimes I just am kicking the walls.
I think the worst hours of our life have been spent in church.
Definitely. Trying to sit for 1 hour or less. It's tough.
If he didn't feel liked, he would take anything very, very deeply. And the best way to describe it is he was just very intense with his emotions, socially, in every way, shape, and form.
With all these symptoms, you might imagine that the ADD child would have problems in many areas of his life. This is often exactly what happens.
The different levels of ADD that I have in my classroom, I guess I could say complement each other, that we don't have too many of one kind or the other. So that you may have a disorganized ADD, and so that's one type of behavior that you have to take care of, and you may have a disruptive ADD or a hounding type of behavior you have to deal with. So I never really have too many of them at one time.
What we're going to do at this point is take a look at, if we take Virginia Douglas' stop, look, and listen theory, or look at all the symptoms that I just presented to you, we're going to take a look at how these would affect a child throughout the course of a day in his life. We'll take a look at how they might affect him at school, at home, and socially. And what I'm going to describe to you, which is important to keep in mind, is an ADD child who has full syndrome, untreated attention deficit. That means all 8 symptoms, and nobody's doing anything about it, or what they're doing is not really very effective. What would this child be like at school, at home, and with friends? Now, if you have ADD without hyperactivity, not all of this will apply. Even if you have ADD with hyperactivity, kids still have different profiles, so you have to take it with a grain of salt. But let's pretend we have a child who has all 8 symptoms. He starts out his day with going to school. Somebody said once that if you had to sadistically and maliciously design an environment for an ADD child to drive him crazy day in and day out, you couldn't come up with anything better than school. Why? Because school requires that he sit still and concentrate on things that he almost invariably finds boring. There may be exceptions to it, but most of the ADD kids will find school boring. So the child is likely to become a significant negative force in the classroom because he can't sit still and concentrate very well. He's going to run into difficulties with the teacher. He's not going to be able to follow rules, especially when the rules change. An ADD child will have a much easier time going from a structured to an unstructured situation and vice versa. So he can go from math to recess without too much difficulty, but if you're the teacher that gets him after recess for social studies, watch out. You'll hear teachers say all the time, he came back from lunch or recess and I couldn't get him to calm down for 40 minutes, in my class. So they don't switch back well. What's the teacher's response? Well, what a lot of teachers will do is they try and control the child. It's a natural response. So they can try and control the kid. He acts up more. They try and control him more. He acts up more. We often say that by the time April rolls around, the kid hates the teacher hates the kid, the parents hate the teacher, the parents hate the kid hates everybody, and the whole thing is just a big mess. And that is often what happens. So it snowballs as things go on throughout the year. What about the IQs of ADD kids? What about learning disabilities? We have research that shows that ADD kids have IQs that are probably what we call normally distributed. And what that means is that we have our smart ones, we have our average ones, and we have our below average ones in terms of brain power. But probably all of them cannot use the material that they have in terms of IQ very well because of the attentional problem. And so they don't tend to do as well in school. What about learning disabilities? Learning disabilities, it's a little different story. It is true that ADD kids are a multiply handicapped group much of the time. In fact, ADD kids are more prone toward allergies, they're more prone toward fine and gross visual motor coordination problems, they're more prone toward bedwetting, and they are more prone toward learning disabilities as a group. The percentage of ADD kids that are also learning disabled varies a lot depending on who you're reading. I've seen estimates 30% and I've seen estimates 85%. What I've been seeing more recently is estimates around the 30% level. Whereas you'd expect in the general population you might have 15% of the kids are learning disabled. In the ADD population it may be twice that. So you have a kid who is doubly cursed. He's ADD plus he's LD. And differential diagnosis between ADD and LD is very tricky. Trying to tell the difference. Is it one, the other, or both? Is a very hard question to answer when you're trying to do an evaluation. Our ADD friend in school is also likely to have very uneven academic performance, and this can drive people crazy. You can have a good day, a bad day, a good hour, a bad hour, a good month, a bad month, and a good year, and a bad year. If he has a good year and a bad year, it's almost invariably a teacher interaction effect. ADD children are extremely sensitive to their teachers. If they like the teacher and the teacher likes them, the chemistry, so to speak, is really good. These kids can do just very, very well for often a whole year. They'll work for the teacher gives them a little break here and there, and they do just fine. The next year they go back to another teacher who doesn't know much about ADD, and the year can be a disaster. Unfortunately, more years tend to be disastrous than positive that way. But we'll get kids that are very, very uneven. One of the things that always intrigues the daylights out of me is when we get a junior high child come in. He's now departmentalized. He has, say, 7 or 8 different classes. And on the same report card, this one child for a quarter will get every grade known to man. He'll have an A, a B, a C, a D, and an F. These kids come in and I say, you know, I don't know whether to congratulate you or what to say to you because you have just accomplished something that is very unique. And they'll say, what? I say, you just got one of each grade. And the A isn't always gym. Last kid I had do this, the A was social studies and the F was science. And one of each grade. And if you go through that child report card, you will find that the grade in each course will reflect his liking of the teacher and his liking of the course. Now that's assuming that the brain power is there to do all of them. But what this makes teachers and parents say is stuff like, you can do it if you really want to. And I always say, please don't say that to your kids. Okay? They do want to. Most ADD kids want very badly to do well, but they can't sustain it. Be like you and I, you know, maybe we could run 50-yard dash. No, give me 12 seconds now, but but say we could run a 50-yard dash in 10 seconds. Okay, we can do it. We really want to. We really want to beat this other guy. Okay, that's the first time. But now, you know, 5 minutes later, they said, run the 50-yard dash again in 10 seconds. Well, you know, I'm going to be a little slowed down. They come back again, do it 5 more times. By the end of the day, I can't do that anymore. So they can do it when they want to for short periods of time, but they can't keep it up. So please don't say that because you're setting the child up. They do want to. You have to deal with it with some other methods. But it really doesn't do them any good to say that to them. They hear that all the time, and then they just start thinking that they're bad, they're uncooperative, they're stupid, or whatever. As I mentioned before, in school, ADD kids are known for daydreaming. In fact, a lot of teachers will start suspecting petit mal. Petit mal is a form of epilepsy where a person may stare off for 30 seconds or so, actually kind of lose consciousness, not remember what was going on during that time, and just be looking at the wall. And they hardly move. They don't fall over. It's not like a grand mal seizure. But teachers will see this daydreaming and they'll suspect petit mal. Petit mal is extremely rare. In fact, they say the average teacher is lucky if he or she sees 2 or 3 genuine petit mal cases in the course of a 25, 30-year career of teaching. But you'll see this daydreaming in the child because the child is thinking of things that are more pleasant. And finally, as I mentioned before, ADD kids are often very impulsive and they like to blurt out things in class. In fact, I have a theory that blurting things out in class on a regular basis is almost what we call pathonomic of ADD. Now, this is exaggerated, but it means if you have this symptom, you have this disorder. Like if you're paranoid schizophrenic, if you have auditory hallucinations, that may be almost pathonomic of paranoid schizophrenia. With ADD, I think kids that blurt stuff out on a regular basis inappropriately have a high percentage chance of being attention deficit. Interestingly, a lot of what they'll blurt out will be attempts at a correct answer. A teacher will say, you know, what's the capital of Illinois? Springfield. Well, you know, Mark, that's right, but we have a rule in our class that you're supposed to raise your hand before answering. Oh, yeah, I forgot, I'm sorry. And he'll quiet down. Then you have other ADD kids who are not attempting to answer questions correctly. They are the class clowns. And I know some of you have class clowns in your family. And some of you who are teachers have seen this a lot of the time. Not only are some of these kids a class clown, some of them are very clever and they're good at it. And we always say if you're a teacher and you have a person, an ADD child, and he starts blurting out these funny things, do your best not to laugh. Because if you do, especially early in the year, you may have Johnny Carson or Joni Rivers living with you for the next 8 months. Because once they get that reinforcement, they really want to keep going. So it's hard to, of course, control what the rest of the class is doing. But you don't want to smile or laugh or do that kind of thing if you can. There's an old rule that teachers use some of the time, and that is never smile before November. Have you ever heard that? I think there's some value to that. Okay. The result of all this in school is that the ADD child is likely to be an underachiever. You put all this together, he's not going to get the grades that are commensurate with his ability.
At school, David was hard to control, had a difficult time sitting still, following direction, lack of attention, disruptive to the class, bothered other kids.
He might get out of the chair and He'd go underneath his desk and play underneath there. He would get up and walk around the room. He was bright enough to know if the teacher did something wrong in class, he would shout it out and embarrassing the teacher.
We were having so many problems that his teacher threatened to quit her position because she was having trouble controlling him.
We really felt that our son redefined sibling rivalry. He was not quite 3 when his brother was born, and he was really at the height of every ADD behavior you can possibly imagine at that point, and they were magnified dramatically when his brother was born. He literally tried to kill him. We basically locked the baby in we put him in his crib and locked his door with the infant monitor in his room, because there were too many times when CJ went in the room and threw things at him.
So let's say our little ADD kid went to school and he didn't have a particularly good time. This is a very difficult place for him. He comes home at the end of the day, say, wouldn't it be nice if he could put his feet up, relax, have a good time? Unfortunately, the same 8 symptoms can cause the child problems at home, just as they can cause problems at school. One of them is that the child will be an enigma to his parents and may again stick out like a sore thumb, just like he did in the classroom. ADD kids are often the black sheep of the family. One of the times when an ADD child is not the black sheep of the family is when there's more than one ADD child in the same family. We had, years ago, about a year ago, we thought we had a world's record for most ADD kids in a family. We had a family come in, they had 6 kids, and we thought all 6 were attention deficit disorder. We thought, that's terrible. That's just amazing. These parents, how can they do it? Then we had a family come in, they had 8 children, and we think 7 out of the 8 are ADD. 2 are out of the house, 6 are still living at home. They're all boys. These parents should be the first American saints. They are absolutely incredible what they're doing. It's just, it's unbelievable. They don't always make the bed. They have a little boy who won't sleep with his blanket on because he'll throw it off, so they just dress him in warmer pajamas. Mom has given up making the beds on a lot of the kids because it's just a lost cause, but she'll put the stuff in the room and they can do the best they can with it. The house tends to be kind of a zoo. The good part about that is what? There's no black sheep, everybody's kind of running around doing all this stuff. The bad part is it's very difficult to be there. I've been to one of these houses, and the parents are just lovely people, but it can be a real zoo. We talk about a nice place to visit, but you wouldn't want to live there. You wouldn't be sure you want to visit there for other than short periods of time. But they really have done an amazing job in dealing with that many people, or that many ADD people. But usually the ADD kid is going to tend to stand out, and he's not going to match up with the way the other siblings are operating. They're usually a source of constant disruption. You always know when the ADD child is home. Why? Because you can usually hear them. Okay? If you don't hear them, they're not home. Or, if you know they're home and you don't hear them, find them as fast as you can. Okay. One of the other things that drives parents absolutely buggy is sibling rivalry. Now, sibling rivalry can be bad in its own right, but it's terrible with ADD kids. I mean terrible, and I don't think I have to tell you much about it. The thing that drove me the battiest raising my own 2 kids, with one ADD and one not, was definitely sibling rivalry. It's a never-ending battle. With us, maybe we got lucky. By the time they got teenagers, they went through a period where they started leaving each other alone for a change. And that was very refreshing. And my theory about it is that they're about 22 months apart. My theory about it is my daughter was youngest, and my son started treating her with more respect when she got old enough to have girlfriends that he might be interested in. And so he wasn't about to make a fool out of himself in front of these potential dates, and so he shaped up. So they went through a period where they left each other alone, and believe it or not now, they're both out of the house, but they get along much, much better. But sibling rivalry is just awful. We rack our brains in the office, we rack our brains in our support groups to try and come up with some way of dealing with it. There have been studies that have shown that with ADD children and their parents, there's a high percentage of negative interactions. One study, to our dismay, showed that out of every 10 interactions between a parent and an ADD child, 9 were negative. Of course, and this does nothing for anybody's self-esteem at all. It's quite a stress on everybody involved in the family. The follow-through of these children is often terrible. They're sloppy, as I mentioned before. They'll leave things out. Their rooms are often a mess. They don't really let you parent them very well. They're very hard to parent, sometimes from the very beginning. The result of all this at home, then, is a keen sense of failure and a drop in self-esteem and often depression. But the person you think I'm talking about is probably the child. I'm not talking about the child. The first person to get blasted by the existence of an ADD child in a family is usually the mother. The father is out working with people that are supposedly sane. He may claim differently some of the time. But the mom still gets stuck with raising the little ones. And these little ones don't let you parent them very effectively. And so it does a real job on your self-esteem. In our support groups, one of our main concerns is depression in the mothers of ADD kids, because they don't let you parent them effectively. We always say kind of kiddingly, if you're going to have an ADD child, don't have it be your first one. You know, have a normal kid first, you know, get to learn the ropes, you know, build a little confidence as a parent, and then have your ADD kid. You know, your skin is a little thicker and all that. Of course, that's ridiculous. We did it the wrong way. We had ours first. And I believe I've seen literature that suggests that there is a tendency for ADD children to be firstborn. Not all of them, but more so. But if that's your first experience with you as a parent and you get a child who is very difficult to deal with, you will be devastated. And the mothers are the ones that get it first.
I can remember going out into the garage and sobbing because I couldn't stand it anymore. And because he was crying constantly all the time. And we would sit out in the garage and say, something is wrong, we don't know what's wrong, something's wrong. And this was when he was just 2.
It was just an unbelievably stressful time of our lives for about the first 7 months of his life. And I was convinced for a long time that that's what it was, that it was just the effects of all that stress on him when he was an infant, that he hadn't had good bonding and good nurturing, and that for so long when I was holding him, all I was doing was crying, that I just felt I'd really messed him up. I really thought it was all my fault.
I think until we had the attention deficit diagnosed, he had a tough time dealing with other children. He had trouble making friends. I could kind of see why. He had a tendency to turn them off with his hyperactive behavior. He didn't have a great many friends. If he did, the kids were older. He was much younger. The friendships lasted for a while, and then they kind of fizzled away.
Well, let's go back to our little ADD friend. He went to school, he didn't have such a hot day. He went home, he didn't have such a hot day. He's thinking, well, you know, maybe I can go out and play with my buddies, if there are some, and, you know, kind of get away from all this. Unfortunately, the same symptoms full syndrome, untreated, can cause him problems out in the big bad world. Games that you play with other kids require rules and restraint, and these are things that he's not very good at. Highly competitive, they'll fight, like I said before, take their ball and go home. ADD children are known for what we call low frustration tolerance. Low frustration tolerance means they just can't put up with a lot of things going against them. And so they will take off, or they will quit, or they will get into a fight, or something like that. 2/3 of them, especially when they're young, will tend to be bossy or aggressive. A lot of the times it'll be physical. If they do get into a fight or something goes wrong, they come running home. 100% of the time, they will blame it on everybody else. An ADD child will almost never, ever tell you what they did that contributed to the fight. You could have seen the whole thing, and you can point out to them what they did, and it won't do any good at all. They will tell you what everybody else did. They will tell you that you're being unfair. They will tell you how these kids have been doing this for this, that, and you know, how long. And they certainly have some points. You know, they're not stupid, but they will never take the credit for the fight. They'll always blame it on everybody else. You wouldn't think so, but oddly enough, ADD kids, in spite of these problems socially, initiate a lot of social interaction. You'd think they'd just kind of leave everybody alone, but they will initiate a lot of social interaction. But it's often negative. It's kind of like they don't know how to say hello. We had one little girl in the 3rd grade, and what she would do in the wintertime, when school was over in the cloakroom, people would be putting on their boots and their coats and all this kind of stuff, and she'd go around, she'd kick all the boys in the shins. You know, it was kind of her way of saying, you know, see you tomorrow, have a nice evening. This was initiating something, but it was negative. And of course, it didn't make any friends for her, and it gave her a bad reputation. And that's one of the worries with our ADD kids, that they often get a bad reputation. In groups, as I said before, these kids will often get silly and turn other children off. The result of that is they will play with younger kids. Classic sign of an attention deficit child is one that plays with younger kids, or many times they just wind up isolated and they don't play with anybody. One of the things we'll ask the kids in the office is, who's your best friend? And sometimes we'll see how long it takes them to respond. Sometimes they'll play with older kids, but usually the result is that the ADD child will play with younger kids, or they will not have friends that they can deal with.
Well, he does this to a lot of people. He makes everybody mad, and they just want to go up and punch him or hit him, tease him. So I went up and I was teasing him, and he went and told the lunchroom teacher, and so then I had to sit out in the penalty for the rest of the week.
One of the things that we saw that Jordan had with other peer pressures or relationships with other kids is that he tended to be with kids either 2 years older than him or 2 years less than him. He didn't really stay with his own grade. He'd go higher or lower. He was either command of the little kids or he was the little guy of the big kids.
What is it like to grow up with attention deficit disorder? Unfortunately, we no longer believe that ADD is outgrown. Instead, it persists for most children, showing itself in somewhat different ways at different ages.
We ran into a lot of things that started to give us clues. He wouldn't sit down very long with toys. He would be going from one toy to another. We didn't know if he could stay put until he went to first grade. And once he got into first grade, the teacher kept wondering, is there something wrong? We had to have someone observe him.
The question we're going to address now is, how does full syndrome untreated ADD affect a child in the course of growing up from infancy on to adulthood? And we'll take a look at how the different symptoms manifest themselves at different ages. Starting with infancy, what I'm going to say about infancy you have to take with a little bit of a grain of salt. There are ADD kids that are horrible infants, and there are ADD kids that are wonderful infants, and the same about just average kids. But there is a slight tendency that we've seen in the literature and in the research for attention deficit children to show, as a group, a greater tendency towards certain characteristics. One is a negative response to new situations. Another one is just greater time spent in a negative mood. Some people are born crabs, and some of our ADD kids are born crabs. So you will see some of that. You can see emotional intensity, even in infants. You have to have some perspective on infants to know that this is more intense than the average infant, but you can see that. Eating and sleeping disturbances are not uncommon. Our baby, when he was born, would sleep for about an hour and a half at a time. Then he'd have something to eat. Little devil would just eat enough to fill his stomach and then go back to sleep. Hour and a half later, he's up again. It drives you crazy. Some of them will get into odd vocalizations, funny, repetitive kind of sounds. Actually, some of those can do that when they're 10 years old, too, and drive you nuts with that sort of thing. And a few of them will be resistant of affection. You pick them up and they're kind of pushing you away. That's not real common, but you get a few who don't seem to want to. It's kind of like restraint of trade. They want to be back on the floor running all over the place. But take those with a grain of salt, because a lot of ADD kids are real good, and a lot of them will not show their real true colors as far as hyperactivity goes until around age 2, 18 months to 24 months to slightly beyond. What you see at that time is more of the hyperactivity. You see more of the on-the-go kind of thing. The kid's now walking, running, doing all this type of thing. In fact, partly because of that, a lot of people feel that we can identify 60 to 70% of the ADD kids to be, or ADD kids that already are, by ages 2 to 3. So that's pretty early. And for early detection, that has some promising potential, we think. Accidents can be a problem. I've taken my son to the emergency room at least half a dozen times in the course of his life. We had a great relationship with everybody there. And the accidents that the ADD kids can get into can be a combination of a number of different things. One is impulsivity, acting without thinking. Another is hyperactivity. And another is the fact that a lot of these kids are awkward. They have fine and gross motor coordination problems, so they're always bumping into things. I remember one poor mother that I saw who was convinced that her little 2-year-old girl would not live to see her 3rd birthday. Because when I had seen her this one time, she had fell and hit her forehead on the corner of the coffee table, which can really inflict severe injury. So these kids can really cause some trouble. They'll often stop taking naps at an early age, much to the chagrin of the mother, who would like nothing better than a break in the middle of the afternoon from all this restlessness. You find yourself child-proofing the house more than you would for an average kid. And, as I mentioned before, jealousy with these children is often just awful. Some of them won't show a lot of the ADD symptoms until the birth of a sibling. But many times that occurs around age 2 or 3 anyway, so it's hard to tell exactly what's causing what. When we get to ages 3 to 5, public noncompliance can become more of an issue. You'll find yourselves getting embarrassed more in public with your ADD child. This has been studied, and research with parents of ADD kids has consistently shown that parents, if you ask a parent of a hyperactive child, what's the most difficult situation for you with your child, the parents will consistently report in public. These are the worst times we've ever had. In fact, when we became aware of this in our Illinois support group a couple of years ago, in our newsletter, we sponsored a public embarrassment contest. And what we did was we had people write in, and the goal was, you tell us your most embarrassing experience that you ever went through. And the winners will get their stories published in the newsletter. We'll change the names to protect the innocent as well as the guilty, and if you want, we will do that. We had a couple of winners. That tied. I'll just tell you a story of one of them, and this may ring a few bells with you. One of the mothers who tied for first place in the public embarrassment contest had a little boy, cute little devil. He was 4 years old. She got him ready for church one Sunday, and he was all dolled up in a suit, tie, short pants. Looked just great. She goes to church. She's standing in the vestibule of the church talking to a friend who's in front of her. Her little boy is behind her. All of a sudden, her friend gets this horrified look on her face. The mother turns around like this. What does she see? She sees her 4-year-old with his pants pulled down to his knees, urinating on the carpet of the vestibule of the church. So she tied for first place. She didn't want to, but she did. The result of a lot of this is that you stop going out, or you stop going out together. And sometimes that's the wisest thing. The divide and conquer routine is often a useful goal. Some of you may have heard my story where my wife would ask me, do you want to go on vacation? I'd say, no, thanks, I'd rather go to prison. And she'd say, what's the matter with you? And do you have a bad day? And I'd say, no, I didn't have a bad day, but going on vacation is too much like going to prison. There are 2 prisons when you go on vacation. One is the car, you've been there, and the second one is the motel room. You've all been there, I think, yeah. What are your options? Well, it's real hard. If you went through the sequence we went through, you first think, let's get 2 adjoining rooms. It's too expensive. So I say, no, we got to stay in the same room. So you want to sleep with your spouse, so you put the 2 of you in one bed and you put the 2 kids in the other bed. Lost cause, you know. He's pulling the covers away from my side. No, I'm not. You're pulling off from my side, blah, blah, all this kind of thing. Second alternative then is what? You each take a kid and sleep with them. Well, there's a problem with that. Sleeping with a hyperactive child is like sleeping with a hyperactive octopus. It's also like going 8 rounds with Sonny Liston in the ring. So we scrapped that. What we finally did was my wife and I would take one bed, one take the other, and the kids would sleep with sleeping bags and a pillow, one on one side of this bed and one on one side of that bed, so they couldn't even see each other. And that actually worked fairly well. And then, of course, the other thing you do is you just stop taking vacations. And that's sad, because you like to have these family times together, but it becomes so difficult that you really do cut down on the amount of places that you go. How many of you have been embarrassed in restaurants, where you're kind of a captive audience? You know, you can't get out. It happens all the time. Back to ages 3 to 5, peer problems can become more of an issue as the child graduates from playing by himself, parallel play, to interactive play. The competitiveness and the low frustration tolerance can start causing major problems. You can start getting calls from the school. on a regular basis, even the preschool. For many mothers especially, this is the beginning of what we sometimes call phone phobia. Phone phobia is where the phone rings and you think, oh no, it's the school calling. What did he do this time? And you're right. It is the school calling, and he did do something this time. We've had parents that get calls 3, 4, 5 times a week. You also get the feeling, ages 3 to 5, that discipline doesn't work the same way it did with the other kids if you had other children. This kid just doesn't respond the same way at home or at school. You wonder if they have a conscience. They probably do, as I said, but they don't seem to act like it. And ages 3 to 5 as well, you can start getting destructiveness from the child. Destructiveness can really take 2 forms. One form of destructiveness is a child who, when angry, breaks stuff. And many times they'll break their own things. Sometimes they'll break other stuff in the house, but many times they'll break their own toys and things that they cherish. Now, this will break your heart, too, and you're in a dilemma of what do you do with this? Do you let him break his own stuff, or do you protect him from doing that? In our family, we chose to let him break his own stuff. But it was kind of a heartbreaking decision to do that. There's another kind of destructiveness that is it's not hostile. It's kind of a combination of impulsivity, curiosity, and maybe a few other things. What you get here is a kid who is fiddling around the kitchen one day, and he looks at the radio, and he turns it around. It's got these funny-looking screws on the back of it. They're Phillips screws. And there's this funny-looking screwdriver laying there. He says, I wonder if this fits in here. Well, son of a gun, it does, you know. And half hour later, you've got a dismantled radio. And they don't put it back together. They just shove the tubes in there, slap the backs on, push it up against the wall. My oldest, when he was 10 years old, speaking of non-hostile destructiveness, he, in his bedroom, he discovered one day that in the ceiling there was a push-out panel that led to an attic. And so he knocked it out. He looked up in the attic, and all of a sudden he's in hog heaven. 1,800 square feet of nothing but potential fort. And so he got some plywood up there, and he built this fort and all that, not throughout the whole thing. He had his friends up there. They put posters on the wall. I went up and I checked it out, and I thought, what's the harm? You know, they're not falling through the ceiling, through the insulation and all that. No big deal. A couple months later, we start getting a leak in my daughter's bedroom. And every time it rains, there's water cascading down the side of the wall. The house is new. I figure this doesn't make any sense at all. I look all over. I can't find anything wrong. One day, I'm up in my son's bedroom, and I decide to check his attic. And so I push out the panel. I look up at the ceiling, and what do I see? The sky. And I said to myself, why am I looking at the sky when I should be looking at insulation and wood, you know, or something like that? The reason I was looking at the sky, talk about a little bit of difficulty, delaying gratification, impulsivity, and so on, was he was up there with his buddies one day, and they were playing in their fort, and they thought, it's a little dark up here. Wouldn't it be nice to have a view? And so without thinking much of the consequences, they created a view. And the way they created a view was they took out the ventilator, sheet metal ventilator, that was in the roof. Not the one with the fan, but just those little bubbles that stick up. They just ripped it out with a hammer, screwdriver, pliers, everything they could find. We had a hole in our roof, 18 inches by 34 inches. So when it rained, the water would come straight into the attic, go straight to my daughter's bedroom. We had Niagara Falls down the side of her thing. He was 10 years old and a bright kid. I didn't find him right away. By the time I found him, I have to admit, I was split into 2 pieces. One half of me thought, this is one of the funniest things I've ever seen in my life. The other half of me was going to kill him. And so I said to him, I said, look, I can't believe you did this. I'm not going to tell your mother because she will kill you, I guarantee you. You won't have a chance. What you and I are going to do is we're going to pay for this together. I'll help you with it, but you're going to pay for part of it, and also you're going to help me fix it, and that is what we did. But 10-year-old intelligent child wanted a view. He had it just like that. That's ADD impulsivity. When we get to the kids being in these preschool years, 3 to 5, you often get more parental conflict. Now nothing seems to be going too well. Mom's not handling the kid too well. Dad may not be doing so hot either. And aggravating this is the fact that ADD children respond very differently to their mothers and their fathers much of the time. We'll talk about that a little bit later. We do have evidence, as some of you may know, that the divorce and separation rate in families that have ADD children is higher than the divorce and separation rate in the rest of the population. It's bad enough in the rest of the population. And that can be for obvious reasons, and it can also be for some other reasons that don't directly have to do with the stress of the child, which we may talk about later. Ages 5 to 12, we're now into the elementary years. School complaints can increase. You get more calls from the school. The child is now expected to do more work in school. Homework can increase. Unfinished work can increase. You may get more calls from the school. The child will have more difficulties socially. If there's a learning disability, it may start emerging. Other kinds of acting out can pop up, like fighting. The kid may be a loner. Sometimes they get into stealing things. And lying. The most common type of acting out is probably lying. And the most common type of lying in an ADD child is lying about homework. Kid comes home, do you have all your homework done? Oh, yeah. Yeah. Sure you don't have anything? Nope. You get a call at the end of the week from the teacher. You know, he hasn't done any homework all week. And then you go back to the child, of course, and you have a major problem on your hands. But lying about homework is very, very common. Now, the child is old enough to realize that something is wrong. When these kids are little, we have a lot of just really cute 3- and 4-year-old, hyperactive as all get out kids. They're just adorable. They're driving everybody crazy, but they're still kind of likable. They're having a fine old time. They don't know that anything's wrong. You get 5 to 12, though, and now you get the beginning. This kid is beginning to get some sense of identity, and it's not good. He thinks something is wrong with me. I don't operate the way these other kids do. I'm lazy. I'm stupid. I'm just plain bad. And sometimes they will be called this by other people. So now the child's self-esteem. The mother got it before. Now the child's going to come along for the ride and start having a hard time. A couple of months ago, I was doing this workshop, and I got to this point, and somebody raised their hand. They said, are you going to say anything that's not depressing the whole time? And I said, yes, here comes the first non-depressing thing. If we get into adolescence, there's a strong tendency for the hyperactivity to diminish when the child hits adolescence. That's, as I mentioned before, where the myth came from that hyperactivity would be outgrown. The hyperactivity can be outgrown, but not the attention deficit, the emotional overarousal, and some of the other symptoms that go along with it. But the good news is that some of these kids will simmer down a little bit. Peer problems can continue, however. We'll often ask a parent during a diagnostic evaluation, does your child have any friends? If they say yes, we'll say, well, that's good. Do you like them? And the parents will sometimes say, well, we never meet them. He never brings them over. Or sometimes they'll say, we don't like them, because ADD kids will have somewhat of a tendency to hang out with the burnout crowd, meaning the crowd that also doesn't like school and may not get along with their parents very well. About 25% of ADD children run a high risk of what we call conduct disorder. Conduct disorder is when you get into illegal types of acting out or acting out that is not appropriate for the norms of your age group, like a 9-year-old who's smoking cigarettes and things like that. This 25% of ADD kids that tend to act out are also more at risk for chemical abuse. That's the bad news. The good news is 75% are not in such a high-risk category. But 25% of these kids, we worry about them being ADD, then having problems with acting out, and we worry about their future as adults. Will they become conduct disorders, even sociopathic personalities, and so on? So it's a high-risk group, get in trouble with the law, and they do have a higher risk of chemical abuse. Also, by the time you get into adolescence, the family is often fed up with the kid. They have had it. You ask the parents, you know, how old is your child? And they'll say, well, he's about mid-adolescence. Say, how much longer is he going to be with you? They'll say 3 years, 6 months, 4 days, 12 hours, and you get the idea. They can't wait until the child is gone. One of the things that they're very fed up with is arguing. ADD kids will argue you to death. And one of the things, I might as well make a suggestion right now, is don't argue with them. What we often get is we get an ADD kid, and he's got to have the last word in the conversation. We get a parent, and the parent insists on having the last word in the conversation. Well, if you think about it, mathematically speaking, if you get two people and they each insist that they have to have the last word in a conversation, you have a potentially infinite conversation. And infinite can also mean not only yelling and screaming, but sometimes physical encounters after which everybody feels sick to their stomach. Depression in adolescence is also a higher risk type of affair. Depression in 5 to 12-year-olds, you'll get some of it, but it's not real high incidence. But depression in adolescence is much more risky, and our ADD friends, unfortunately, have a higher risk of running into depression because they've been dumped on for so long. They're not doing well, especially if they're not being treated. And finally, as far as adolescence goes, we do have evidence, as you can easily imagine, that ADD kids are worse drivers than their average counterparts. Now, it may not be so bad that you have to keep them off the road, but we do have evidence, and if you look at the symptom list, imagine an impulsive ADD child on his way to the movies, a little difficulty delaying gratification, a little impulsivity, and he approaches a yellow light. You know, what is he likely to do? Well, it's scary. My oldest in his first 3 months had three problems, 2 accidents and 1 speeding ticket. He's probably a pretty good driver, but a trip with him to Dominic's is one of those deals where you see your life flash in front of you about 8 times. If we ever go somewhere, I always try and get the keys to the truck first so I can beat him to it and drive myself. But he really is a pretty good driver, just though kind of the jackrabbit starts and stops and all that. And it's always scary for parents to think about an ADD child driving. On the positive side, there are some of these kids that, you know, remember novel, interesting, intimidating one-on-one? Those characteristics can make them good drivers. We had one little ADD boy. He was a wild man in school, and he was a wild man at home. But when he'd drive to my office, once he started driving, he'd hang on for dear life like this, going 20 miles an hour. His mother was over there going crazy. She said, "Can't you go any faster?" He's like this. And he's ADD, so you wouldn't really expect that. What about ADD adults? The last section in our developmental course here. First of all, we know now ADD adults do exist. We didn't used to think that they existed. Now we know that they do exist. They may have mellowed out some, but many of them carry the symptoms with them into adulthood. Good news, they get relief from what? From school, which, as I said before, is one of the worst situations you could possibly put them in. So the ADD kids get relief from school. Now they can pick their own poison. They can go get a job somewhere and hopefully find something that suits them a little bit better. Many of these people do well. There's a couple of jobs that you might think ADD kids do well in. One is outside sales. Some of these people are very good at outside sales. In fact, this is a situation where ADD residual symptoms might actually be assets. Imagine somebody who is ADD, but he has good social skills, he's fairly bright, but he's got emotional overarousal and hyperactivity. This person might make a good entrepreneur or salesman. He can run around during the week, sell all these things, drive, move. He likes the movement, see all these people talk, and he enjoys that. The time he'll have difficulty is when he comes home at the end of the week or back to the office and he has to sit behind the desk and do his weekly report. He'll go crazy. Because I have to get up every 5 minutes, go to the bathroom, get a cup of coffee, call my wife, go talk to somebody down the hall, and that type of thing. But they can live with it, and they can often do fairly well. Contact with the law will decrease usually in adult, which is good news. On the other hand, we do have evidence that ADD adults do tend to move more often, they change jobs more often, and I don't know yet if there's research that they divorce more often. My guess is that they might, but I don't have any evidence for that at this point. Their educational and economic level is likely to be overall lower than that of their peers or that of the rest of their family. An interesting question about ADD adults is, do they seek out mental health professionals or psychiatric or psychological help more than the rest of the population? My guess is, although I can't prove it, is that they probably don't. Even though they might need it, I think most of them, because they've been dragged to so many shrinks as kids against their will be darned if they're going to do it on their own when they're adults and it's time where it might be necessary.
Family vacations became a real challenge. Every time we'd leave the house, I'd say within 5 hours, I was swearing I was never going out again on another family vacation. In the future, they could take the vacation without me. It sounds terrible, but this is what's happened.
Did I call them the vacations from hell, or is that not allowed?
I can remember one experience when we were at the store, the grocery store, and he had pulled an orange out, just touching everything in the store, and all the oranges fell down. And then we went to the ball display, he pulled out the bottom ball, and all the balls fell down. And I got quite a few looks in the store just about every time I went, because it was always touch, 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 and then trying to get him to sit down in the grocery cart was even a challenge.
As a parent of 2 ADD children, we've had all kinds of trouble with babysitters. We've come home and had our house ransacked. We've had things destroyed. Babysitters never know what happened. They have trouble. They quit because they can't control the children. It's been just one headache after another as far as babysitters.
All parents worry about their kids' future, but parents of attention deficit children worry a lot more. Is there any way to tell how your ADD child is likely to turn out as an adult?
Will he ever get to the point where he will be able to maintain his social relationships to a point that will allow him to enjoy what we call today a normal, functioning, fulfilling life? And those are probably my key concerns, wouldn't you say?
Mm-hmm. I get panicked when I think about the future. I get nauseous. I get so frightened. He said to me one day a couple weeks ago, "Mom, what happens if you fall in love with someone and they don't fall in love with you?"
How can you predict the future of your ADD child? Fact of the matter is that you can't, but you can do some guessing. And what I'm going to do is give you a list of what we call 7 prognostic indicators that have been shown by some of the research to be connected with adult outcome. So this is kind of a quick and dirty survey. You can kind of run it through in your mind, and maybe it'll give you some idea of how your child might turn out as an adult, and hopefully some reassurance. So the 7 prognostic indicators are these. First one is socioeconomic status. The higher, the better. This may sound like a bit of snobbery. We're not sure exactly why that's the case. Maybe these people are better educated. Maybe they spot problems more quickly. Maybe they can afford counseling. Maybe they can afford to continue counseling. Whatever the case, that one is helpful. Second prognostic indicator is IQ. The higher, the better. IQ is a great compensator for a lot of other faults, like learning disabilities as well as attention deficit disorder. Imagine 2 kids in a class, one with a very high IQ and one with an average IQ, and they're both ADD. They both have low frustration tolerance for math. They're both given the same problem. The high IQ ADD child can finish it in 5 minutes and be done, be correct, be happy, be reinforced by the teacher. The average IQ ADD child may take 12 minutes. But his frustration tolerance only goes to 7.5 minutes. So after 7.5 minutes, he quits. What happens to him? He gets dumped on. He gets criticized, he feels like a failure, and he knows he's not succeeding. So IQ can be very, very helpful. The third prognostic indicator is aggressiveness. The higher, the worse. And especially if it's not outgrown by the time the child hits early adolescence and adolescence. If they're still aggressive at that time, then we get worried. Same thing with hyperactivity, the fourth prognostic indicator. The more hyperactivity, the worse, and especially if it's not outgrown by the time the child hits adolescence. If you still have a high level of hyperactivity, you're going to have more problems. The one thing about that that's a little bit of a catch is with the girls again. We sometimes wish that the girls, some of them, were a little more hyperactive so they'd come to the attention of people who might diagnose them and then treat them appropriately. The next prognostic indicator is social skills. Social skills is extremely important. No matter what area of your life you're going into, your social skills and social status is a very powerful predictor of how well you're going to do, whether it's business or anything to do with psychology. One interesting study, by the way, studied schizophrenics. And the researcher found that if you were schizophrenic, if you were a likable schizophrenic, your prognosis was better than if you were an obnoxious schizophrenic. Now, that may sound kind of silly, but it's true. And what sort of social skills you have really makes a difference. The next prognostic indicator is early detection. This is a rather obvious one, whether you're talking about cancer, learning disabilities, or attention deficit disorder. The earlier you pick up something, the better off everybody is. We get a lot of kids coming into the office when they're 16, 17, 18 years old. Some of them we can help, some of them it's too late. Some of these kids will just sort of stare at you with a blank look on your face. You'll talk about ADD. You might talk about the different therapies. You might talk about medication could help concentration in school, make school easier for them, and they'll just look at you. Some of them probably feel like spitting in your face, but if it's too late, many times we lose them. So the earlier, the better. The last indicator that you can think of to try and predict how your child is likely to turn out is what you might call family strength or parental psychopathology. Parental psychopathology is just kind of a fancy way of saying that the better put together mom and dad are, the better off the child's likely to be. So if mom and dad are reasonably competent, caring, intelligent parents, the child's going to be better off. And if the family as a unit has some strength and bonding to it, the child's likely to be better off. So with those 7, you can't exactly predict the future of your child, but you can at least come up with some guess as to how your boy or girl is likely to turn out after they leave home and are on their own.
When I think about the kids' futures, it's scary. Sometimes I say to myself, geez, I hope someone will marry them. I hope they can finish school. It's hard for me to picture them as functioning adults. I know it happens, and I know it's possible. Right now, it's hard to believe that they will, in fact, get to that point, that they can function as adults.
In some ways, I feel encouraged because I know that I know that I have done. We've done everything that we could to help the situation, and I feel lucky because our children are very bright, and we have been able to place them in a good school situation. So I feel encouraged that way. But I know that it's always going to be a struggle for them. I have high hopes that they can overcome this problem.
I don't know yet. I'm thinking of being a sports player. I don't know.
What causes ADD? We can't yet say for sure that we know, but we're getting some pretty good ideas.
Their psychologist interviewed us, and they instill a lot of guilt to you. We also went to a private psychologist who instilled a lot of guilt. They say, well, the mother is excessively cold, very distant from the child, and you're thinking, oh, I really didn't think I was that way, but maybe I am. Maybe he's right. He's an expert in this. Maybe he's right.
I want to discuss this by first telling you some of the things that don't cause attention deficit disorder. Number 1, we don't think that diet causes ADD. Diet, it's true, you can have kids that respond poorly to some things that they eat, and it can cause some bad behavior, but we don't think that's true attention deficit disorder. The same with allergy. There are kids that are allergic, and kids that are allergic can be kind of crabby, and they can cause some trouble. But we don't think that that is genuine ADD. Another theory, and by far the most common theory in the society that you live in today, is what we call the psychogenic theory or the family dynamic theory, the psychological theory, whatever you want to call it, for ADD. This theory, if you state it very simply, goes something like this. Screwy kids are caused by screwy parents. So if you have a kid who's acting funny, mom and dad are either consciously or inadvertently doing something weird at home that's messing this kid up. You will run into this theory when you see mental health professionals. You run into it with the pediatrician. You run into it at your family reunion from your relatives and cousins and grandparents and all this type of thing. It is by far the most dominant theory in our society. For years and years and years, psychology and psychiatry have focused on the effect of the parents on the kids, as if the kid was just a blank slate. He was clay, and we're the sculptors of this kid. Well, if you have an ADD child, it feels the reverse. You feel like you're the clay and he's the sculptor. And what the research is focusing on now is the effect of kids on parents. There are a number of studies that show that kids are born with widely different temperaments. And some of these temperaments are very placid, and some of them are very aggressive. Some of these kids come running out, and they come after you right away. So we in the field don't really believe the psychological or psychogenic theory anymore with ADD. I'll just give you a couple of examples. There's a very good article by a guy named Bell back in 1968, and he pointed out some rather obvious things. He said, what if you have a family where you have 4 kids, one is ADD, and the other 3 are doing just fine? Wouldn't you think that if mom and dad were such screwballs that all the kids would be messed up? Okay? Yes, you would. Now, family therapists and other people come back and they'll say, wait a minute, how naive can you be? What about birth order? You know, and things like this. Well, listen, I'll give you 2 points for birth order, but birth order is not going to account for the behavior of some of these children. So we always say, if you don't remember anything else from this workshop, I would like you to try and remember that if you have an ADD child, it is probably not your fault. So what causes it? Well, there have been neurological theories. I told you before, the minimal brain damage theory, that's a neurological structural theory, we call it. It says that the brain is actually damaged. There's lesions or tissue damage, and that causes hyperactivity. Remember Rutter's study in 1977? He proved that most hyperactive kids have no hard evidence of brain damage. So we kind of canned that one. Then there's a theory that is a biochemical theory, and this is one that we do give some credence to. The biochemical theory says that in the brains and central nervous systems of ADD kids, there may be a biochemical imbalance that causes a problem. And the biochemical imbalance may actually cause the central nervous system, or just think about the brain of the ADD child to actually be understimulated. And you think, well, that's weird. This kid's overstimulated, and you're telling me his brain is understimulated. But if you think of it like this, by analogy, imagine you had a governor of a state, and the governor of the state was lazy. He's drinking all day, he's goofing around, you know, he never gets out of bed, and he doesn't even look out the window. What would happen to that state? That state would be chaotic. Okay? People would be running around, beating each other up. The mail wouldn't get delivered on time. People would be robbing each other. Taxes wouldn't be paid. If we could stimulate that governor to get out of bed, drag him over to the window, open the curtains, he says, holy Toledo, this is terrible. I better get going. And he starts doing something about it. Maybe we could get the state less chaotic and more organized. We think that when stimulant medications and other medications may work with an ADD child, what they do is they stimulate that lazy governor up here in the child's brain, so that the governor organizes the child's activities in a way that makes more sense, and so the child becomes more orderly. Now, this is just a theory and it's analogy. We haven't proved it yet, but there is more and more evidence that that seems to be going on. What is the culprit? We think the culprit is really the way that neurons communicate with each other. Neurons are cells in your brain and your central nervous system that are like the wiring. And unlike electrical wires, they don't hook up like this. They sit off at a distance from one another. So how do they connect, or how do they communicate? They communicate by spitting chemicals back and forth. So if you imagine my arm being a neuron, this being a neuron, and these being the branches at the end, these things actually shoot chemicals called neurotransmitters across this gap till they hit this other neuron. And if enough of these neurotransmitters and the right kind shoot across, this neuron may fire. We think in the brains of ADD kids there may be a deficiency in a neurotransmitter. Sometimes they talk about one called dopamine. So it's not shooting the gap here, with the result that this neuron isn't firing, with the result that the central nervous system is underactive, with the result that the kid's behavior is chaotic. So the theory is that. We haven't proved it yet, but it's what you might call the lazy governor theory. Lazy governor and chaotic child. We also believe, in addition to the biochemical thing, that ADD is probably hereditary most of the time. It means the child is born that way. When we do interviews with the parents, since ADD, as many of you know, is a male-dominated problem, we'll often ask the parents, what were you like as kids? They're the biological parents, of course. And we'll usually start with the father, because mostly it's males. Now, sometimes it's the mothers, too. But we'll ask a father, you know, how did you do in grammar school? Some of the fathers will sit there and they'll kind of squirm around a little bit. You know, their wife will go, come on, tell him. You know? So the father will say, well, you know, tell you the truth. This kid's kind of a chip off the old block. I was pretty much the same way. Now, it's not always exactly, you know, a dead ringer for dad, but we do find that a lot of the dads had very similar problems to what their kids had, and a lot of the mothers did as well. So we do believe, in a sense, that ADD is a hereditary biochemical disorder that your child was born with. You didn't train him to be that way, and it's something that you all have to live with. So in a sense, we say that ADD is nobody's fault. It's not the parent's fault. It's not the child's fault, but it's there, and it's something that you definitely have to live with. So what causes ADD? Probably a biochemical inherited problem that the child may have to live with for a long period of time. We sometimes say, by the way, if you, before you know that ADD is inherited and biochemical, you might think the psychological theory, so you and your spouse will argue about which one of you is screwing up the kid. After you find out that it's hereditary, you can argue about whose side of the family is it coming from.
Well, my brain makes liquids, and the attention liquid that it makes some, but doesn't make enough. But when I have the pills, it helps it to make just enough liquid to pay attention.
I think a lot of times we as teachers come in with our, out of our ivory tower with our ideals and our expectations, and it's very easy to try to pin blame for a student's behavior on parents, on the home life. Being a parent on the other side, you realize that it's not all that easy. You understand the frustrations. You understand what it's like being on the other end of a staffing table.
Before the kids were diagnosed with attention deficit, I definitely thought that I was a total failure as a parent. Couldn't figure out what I had done wrong. Figured I must have missed something in home economics. Missed part of the lecture somewhere that I just did not seem to grasp what was involved to become a good parent.
In my own experience, being the male, being the quote-unquote breadwinner, being in the job outside the home, you have a tendency to focus externally and think that, well, gee, why isn't this working at home? I mean, you're at home all day, you're with the child, can't you get a handle on this?
The sex ratio in ADD kids is 6-to-1 males to females, maybe. If we were identifying all the girls that maybe we should be identifying, the ratio might drop to 4-to-1 or 3-to-1. So we don't really know yet what the deal is there. Don't ever forget that hyperactive children can sit still. Novel, interesting, intimidating, one-on-one. Okay, they can sit still some of the time. Not all of them and not all the time, but you'll see bewildering breaks in their ADD symptoms. Moms versus dads. I mentioned this before. There's a very strong tendency for attention deficit children to respond better to their fathers than to their mothers. And I don't think it's the mother's fault. I think the reason for this is dad is less familiar, more intimidating, larger, and more often to use screaming or physical violence in dealing with the child. I'm not talking about necessarily abuse. Mom is more familiar and all the rest of those things. Dad is also a male. And a natural part of growing up is supposed to be identifying with a parent of the same sex. So little girls are supposed to identify their mothers, and little boys are supposed to identify with their fathers. Many of these little ADD boys adore their fathers, but they don't adore their mothers. They think dad walks on water. They think mom drowns in water. Okay. So you'll get this disagreement. So we always say to the moms, look, this probably is not your fault that the child responds more poorly to you. You've got the dirtier job. We always say to the dads, don't go around feeling so cocky or so superior. You have kind of an unfair natural advantage, but use it. It's very helpful. Don't just go hide in the closet and say, well, what the heck, I'm not going to use it anymore. You can be of great assistance. Now, if we take these last two things that I just mentioned, ADD kids can sit still, and fathers have an advantage, and we put them together, what I'm going to do is describe what I call a day in hell in the life of the mother of an ADD child. Okay? And it goes something like this. This mother has a 4-year-old. This 4-year-old has been driving her absolutely nuts. He just got kicked out of preschool. He terrorizes his younger sister all the time. He doesn't obey at all. She found him the other day 5 blocks away from home, and she had no idea where he was. She says, I got to do something. Sets up a appointment with a pediatrician for 11 o'clock in the morning. Okay? Got to do something. Maybe the doctor can help me. Pediatrician is a doctor who doesn't know that 80% of hyperactive kids will sit still in his office. Okay? So mom goes in there, Doc, this kid's driving me nuts. We got to do something. She describes the whole thing to him. Doctor says, gee, it sounds pretty serious. Let me see the child. So the child walks into the office, stands there like this. Doctor says, well, Tommy, how are things going? Oh, pretty good, thank you, sir. Well, your mom says you're having a little bit of trouble at home. Oh, yeah, sometimes I do. You fight with your sister some of the time? Yeah, I do. How are things going in school? Oh, they didn't like me too much at school. And the whole interview goes like that. The kid hardly moves. The doctor, believing that a hyperactive child could not do that, has to come up with some other interpretation. Mom comes running back in at the end of the interview. Doc, what do you think? What's he going to conclude? Mom is either nuts, mom is exaggerating the problem, or mom is causing the problem by some kind of faulty parenting. And so he's going to communicate that to this poor mother. Well, how is she going to react? She's going to believe him. He's the expert. She's not the expert. How is she supposed to know? So she goes home crushed. She knows she's doing something wrong, but she doesn't know exactly what it is. Sometimes the doctors will also make suggestions that are really rather absurd. I had one mother tell me about a doctor who suggested that what she'd do on the way home was buy this kid about a half a dozen models, airplanes, cars, and all this stuff, have him sit down at home and make these things, and that would teach him concentration and the ability to sit still. Well, he got less than 1/8 of the way through the first model before he destroyed the thing out of complete frustration, and so that didn't work. But let's go back to our day in hell here. This poor mom goes home, and she's got this 4-year-old. ADD kids are not always known for their sympathy. In fact, a lot of times they're more like a shark who's going for blood, or a wolf, they're going for the jugular. And so this 4-year-old crucifies mom all afternoon. He pulls stuff he didn't even dream of before. I mean, he's just giving her a hard time. She's feeling guilty, depressed, and this kid is murdering her. 6 o'clock, it's at its worst. The kid comes in, she's cooking dinner. He says he wants a candy bar. She won't give it to him. He throws a pot across the floor, almost breaks the window, throws himself down, yelling, screaming, doing all this kind of stuff. Dad walks in the door. Dad sees what's happening, looks down at the kid, says, "Knock it off, young man, or I'll kick your butt from here to Alaska." And the kid freezes. And then Dad looks over at Mom and says, "Now, why the hell can't you do that?" Now, where is our mother? Well, her opinion of men may not be so hot, but the worst part of it is that her opinion of herself is real bad. She has had 3 males today demonstrate without a shadow of a doubt that she's incompetent. A pediatrician, her husband, and her child. What was the problem? The problem was really ignorance. There's a pediatrician who did not know that 80% of these kids are going to sit still in his office because they're intimidated. It was a father that did not know that he had an unfair natural advantage, and it was a mother that didn't know that stuff either. The kid doesn't know much. He's only 4 years old. So we always say education is very, very important. Educating a pediatrician, educating the family, so you don't have to go through that kind of thing. Is there a cure for ADD? The answer is no. There probably never will be, but there are treatments, and we'll talk about those a little bit later. What about the siblings of attention deficit children, biological siblings? The prevalence of ADD in the general population is probably 5 to 10%. It means 5-10% of our school-age kids are probably attention deficit, probably closer to 5. What if you already have an ADD child? What are the chances that another natural sib of that kid will be attention deficit? The odds jump from 5 to about 25 to 30%. I've had mothers in the office some of the time, and we have just diagnosed a 5-year-old as attention deficit disorder, and they're pregnant. And all of a sudden they look at me and they go, "Oh my God." And they'll ask the question, they'll say, what are the chances that this one, not knowing it's hereditary, what are the chances that this one will be ADD? And I'll tell them the chances are 25, 30%. That's the bad way of phrasing it. The good news is at 70% he won't be. But, you know, you kind of take your chances, and the mechanics or the mechanisms of hereditary, as many of you know, are very erratic. What about the parents of ADD kids? Most of us here today are probably parents of attention deficit children. What can you say about us psychiatrically and psychologically? Well, you got to be careful with this a little bit, but studies have shown that those of us who are parents of attention deficit children as a group have a greater tendency towards certain psychiatric disorders than the rest of the population. I'm going to list them for you. None of them will sound good, but it doesn't mean you have to have one, okay, or 2. But here's what they are. First one, a biological parent of an ADD kid. There's a greater tendency toward depression, especially in the mothers. Chicken and the egg problem here. Is it biological depression, or is it that it's depressing raising an ADD child, and that's what stimulated it? Second problem in parents is alcoholism, especially in the fathers. Again, chicken and the egg. Is this father biologically predisposed to drink too much, or is that his way of dealing with coming home to a chaotic home situation every night? Third one is hysteria, especially in the mothers. Hysteria is like the emotional overarousal. That's one of the prime symptoms of attention deficit disorder. Some of these mothers, though, you talk to them, and they'll come in, and those of you who are teachers here and mental health professionals, you want to keep this in mind. Parents of ADD kids won't present very well a lot of the time, especially the mothers. They'll come in depressed, angry, fed up, yelling, just everything. And you're inclined to think, after talking to them, hell, lady, if I had a mother like you, I'd be hyperactive myself. That may not be fair. You ask that lady, what were you like before this child was born? Some of them will say, that's nothing. I was this way my whole life. I've always been a live wire. But others will tell you, and they'll be sad when they tell you, they will tell you, before I had this child, people used to tell me I was laid back, I was calm. They would compliment me on that. And after I had this child, it was a totally different story. Number 4, those of us who are parents of ADD kids, is sociopathy, especially in the males. Kind of a fancy word. All it means is the ability to engage in antisocial behavior that might hurt other people or be illegal without feeling guilty about it. Number 5, that this group has more of, is psychosis, which could mean schizophrenia, could mean some of the manifestations of manic depressive illness. And number 6, of course, is residual ADD. So those of us who are parents have more of a tendency toward all that stuff. But remember, it's not necessarily take your pick. You could have 3, but you could have 0. I won't tell you which ones my wife thinks I have, because I don't think that's appropriate for the workshop. But you can think it over, and it is serious and it is disturbing some of the time when we get into that. So if you are a parent of an ADD child, that's something that you may want to explore a little bit further.
And I would have these long days where it was just all I could do to keep things from getting broken and keep people from getting hurt and keep things as much under control as I could. And I would be so frazzled by the time Ken would walk in the door and say, I really have a problem with you always being angry at him. And I would want to kill him. Not the child, but the husband. I would want to hurt him because I think you don't have a clue as to what I've gone through today.
This concludes part 1, our presentation of ADD symptoms, development, prognosis, and causes. In All About ADD part 2, we'll discuss diagnosis and treatment.